All right, part two. Hopefully, I don't have to do a part one and part two for every module, but we'll see what happens. so, during the Enlightenment slash Renaissance, 1700s, late 1600s, early 1800s, that period in Europe, there emerged a big giant debate between the rationalists and the empiricists. So I'm going to spend a good bit of time describing what these two schools of thought entail and how they affected um, psychological theory later on. It's a little bit of previews. So, rationalism is the view that basically we have these innate concepts uh, pre-wired into our minds slash brains, and we perceive the world, but really it's sort of we have to actively construct what we're seeing, and all the important knowledge and the important concepts that we acquire have to be created and constructed out of these raw materials that are our innate concepts or innate ideas. It's a very active picture of how the mind works and develops over time. So a couple of, I'm fast forwarding ahead in time, a couple of famous psychologists who you could say vaguely resemble the rationalists from this period are Vygotsky, up here at the top left. You may not have heard of Vygotsky before. He coined the term scaffolding. Scaffolding. Scaffolding is when you're building a building and you have to construct these temporary structures around the building so that you can build it. Like you can work on the outside of the building and you're going to take the scaffolding down at some point. Sorry, I'm a little congested. The idea with psychological scaffolding is that when you're teaching someone or you're mentoring or tutoring someone, you need them to construct their own concepts and their own understanding. And you as an instructor need to only build the scaffolding, the sort of temporary structure that's going to help them build themselves up, and you're not going to be there to kind of spoon feed them all their information. You're there to support their growth while they create their own concepts. And then there's Jean Piaget, who hopefully you've heard about either in a developmental class or in Intro to Psychology. Piaget's constructivist framework, these are both constructivist psychologists, also bears a strong resemblance to rationalism. Piaget believes that we start with some basic schema or concepts or conceptual frameworks. They're very crude when you're first born. You can barely make sense out of the world. But as you experience the world and you find these strange new phenomena, you have to work on your schema, your conceptual framework, to accommodate these experiences. Like if you find that you throw certain things and some things bounce and other things just plop onto the floor and make a loud noise, you have to ask yourself, why do some things bounce after you throw them and other things hit the floor and don't bounce? My son is currently apparently trying to figure this out. That's how you build up your conceptual framework. You try things, you experience things, some things make sense according to your current schemata or schemas, and some things don't. And you go through these stages of cognitive development. This is something Piaget is known for. You start off having a very concrete understanding of the world, and then you slowly build up more general and more abstract concepts. Piaget also coined the term object permanence, which you may have heard about in your developmental classes. Maybe so, maybe no. Object permanence is this idea that at some point when you're very young, you realize that just because you can't see an object anymore doesn't mean it's no longer there. So my 18-month-old son is well beyond the object permanence threshold. If I show him a toy and then I put a rag over the toy, he knows the toy is under the rag. But if he was less than 6 months old, so less than a third of the age he is now, he might not understand that because he might not have object permanence yet because his concepts have not been built up to accommodate those kind of experiences. Going back in time, the main rationalist from the Enlightenment period, there were many rationalists, but sort of the main one was Rene Descartes. Descartes is a very interesting thinker. He came up with the idea of coming with having a coordinate system or Cartesian plane with x's and y's, and you can plot it and plot functions and use analytic algebra to solve geometry problems. So if you hated learning that kind of stuff in high school, you can go ahead and be angry at Descartes. He was also a soldier and he tutored royalty. He led a very interesting life. Supposedly, he had a daughter, an illegitimate daughter, who died in childhood, and he built a replica, a robot, and was a little cuckoo about it. But if you're really interested in Descartes' life, it is interesting. I'll let you go off and learn about that on your own. Let's just talk about his ideas that pertain to psychology. So, Descartes paradoxically believed that the mind and the body are fundamentally different things. Yet at the same time, he believed that you can account for much of your behavior and your psychology in terms of physical mechanisms. So nerve endings, electrical relays and switches. He wouldn't have used that vocabulary. He talked about animal spirits or animal magnetism. But if you go see what exactly he meant by animal spirits or animal magnetism, you find that it actually corresponds pretty well with what the average person probably thinks about how, locomotion and planning out motor movements and reflexes and all that. His theory of how biologically that all plays out is, in the abstract, very similar to what most people would believe these days. So it's very revolutionary at the time. But even though much of our, I don't want to say mental life, much of the intelligent behaviors we engage in, our reflexes, our locomotion, our perception, kind of low level stuff, that stuff can be accounted for with physical matter, just biology. But Descartes thought at some point the body ends and the mind begins. And the mind is something completely different from the body. The mind interacts with the body, but it is not identical to the body. It was also very important to him that we have innate ideas or innate concepts. If you go read up on Descartes, this plays a very important role. He used, well, I actually got rid of the Euclid stuff this time around. So let's just keep it at, according to Descartes, the most important stuff in your life, your mind, has to actively reconstruct all of its knowledge, and a lot of your knowledge and concepts gets built up, sort of pulling itself up by its own bootstraps. It's not that all your mind and your concepts and your ways of thinking emerge from experience. You can experience and perceive things, but that's largely because your mind is using its raw material and actively constructing all of that stuff. So let's contrast all of this with empiricism. The general idea with empiricism is that your brain / mind starts off as kind of a blank slate. You don't have any innate concepts or innate knowledge. The world is what, as William James put it, I love this, a blooming, buzzing confusion. So when you're born, It's just the sensory data that is uninterpretable, meaningless. You have to slowly, quote unquote, notice that there are certain regularities. You start to see certain patterns and you can start to recognize certain objects. This is where I drink from. That's my mommy, that's my daddy. Although you don't have those concepts of mommy and daddy, you might instead just say, oh, there's that person I like, or there's that other person I like. I know who that is. There's a sense in which your sensory sensations kind of uh, build associations over time, and that's ultimately where all your concepts come from. You experience all these particular visual stimuli, let's say. You see the same object from different angles. You slowly abstract all the different times you've seen this particular object into an abstract idea of that object. So now when you see it, even if it's not under the same lighting or the same angle, you're able to kind of generalize. And that's what concepts are. They're generalizations from your sensory data. And that's how the mind is built up. It's more of a passive process compared to the rationalist picture of the mind. It's more like the world is building your concepts onto your brain, or your brain is accumulating concepts from your sensory data. It's less emphatic about your brain or your mind sort of actively piecing things together. I'll say that most psychologists today are probably a combination of these two schools of thought, but they probably lean a little more towards empiricism. And that might be because, as we'll learn in a later chapter, probably the most dominant way of conceptualizing the mind is a strong biological view of the mind. So, sorry, Descartes. Descartes would have said, yeah, a lot of psychological stuff you can chalk up to just biological stuff, but there's a lot more kind of human level stuff like ideas and creativity and whatnot that isn't part of the physical brain matter. Nowadays, people would say, no, it's all brain matter, and probably the sort of gold standard of making new discoveries in psychology, in experimental psychology at least, is with neuroimaging techniques such as fMRI, which we're going to learn more about later on. And most people implicitly adopt kind of an empiricist way of looking at the mind. And by implicitly, I mean they never stop and spell it out. This is how we're adopting an empiricistic view of the mind. But if you read between the lines, that seems to be how they're looking at things. They kind of see the brain, yes, it does do some active, constructive stuff. It is kind of hard to observe that with neuroimaging techniques. What you can observe is how the brain accumulates experiences and abstracts from those experiences to create uh, concepts. If I say create, it's more of a um, passive process, not creating, active. So let's meet some historical empiricists. Here we have Hobbes, not to be confused with the tiger from Calvin and Hobbes. I've got a note here about Euclid. Yes, Euclid was very influential in the history of ideas, but I removed him from this round because I felt like we needed to be more focused, so I kind of trimmed the fat a little bit. But Hobbes believed that humans are inherently selfish, full of vice, and they need the monarchical government to protect them from themselves. So if you're a libertarian, you're probably not going to like Hobbes. But he was a very influential thinker in terms of human nature and human behavior. And his ideas were used to justify monarchy. You know, we need a king to protect ourselves from our worst instincts. And he said there are no innate ideas. All of our concepts are ultimately derived from our sensory experiences. And then you have John Locke, probably the most famous empiricist from this period. He coined the phrase tabula rasa, which means blank slate. And he talked about this idea of there being kind of like a chemistry of ideas. I kind of talked about that a little bit in previous slides. But basically, just to elaborate more, Locke believed that we develop concepts like red and little and ball by seeing lots of red things and lots of little things versus larger things. And we see balls versus blocks, balls versus baby dolls. And you build up these more general uh, you build up more general concepts by abstracting away. You see a little red ball, for instance. Eventually, not every perception. So a perception has to be very specific. It's a combination of characteristics and ideas. But eventually, you're able to abstract the simpler, more atomic uh, ideas. In a way, you could think of it as our perceptions are molecular. They consist of a bunch of uh, ideas in combination, like red plus little plus ball. As we experience other things that are red but are not little and not a ball, or something that's little but is not a ball nor red, we can start to tease out these more abstract things. Like there's this thing called red, and that's where your concept of redness comes from, is just all the red things you've seen. What do they all have in common? They're all red. Um, I do want to note, though, that I'm kind of oversimplifying Locke a little bit. If you actually get deep into the weeds with Locke, um, it's actually kind of debatable whether he's as pure of an empiricist as he seems to be, at least from the way a lot of history books talk about him and the way the slides are going. But yeah, he is. If he had to be either an empiricist or an irrationalist, he would definitely be an empiricist. But he had some rationalistic tendencies. Locke also, this is kind of an important distinction. You might even see this, or remnants, implicit. You might see this implicit in some studies being done today. Locke had this idea about objects in the world that we perceive having primary qualities and secondary qualities. In a way, you could think of this as the primary qualities are real. They exist out in the world regardless of if we're there to perceive them. This is like the shape of an object, its weight, um, stuff like that. And then you have the secondary qualities, which are the aspects of an object that don't exist unless someone perceives it. So the taste of an object. An object doesn't have a taste if no one exists in order to taste it, right? So take a pizza, for instance. If you just went to another planet and dropped a pizza there and no one's around to eat it, then you could say the pizza has certain primary qualities in and of itself. It has a certain geometrical shape, size, weight. It has these physical properties that have an independent existence, right? There's nothing subjective about them. But it also has secondary qualities, which do depend on there being a perceiver. A pizza has a certain smell, a certain taste. Those are things that don't exist unless there's someone to perceive them. But, Locke said, the primary qualities do somehow cause the secondary qualities. There's something about the chemical makeup of a pizza that makes it smell the way it does or taste the way it does. You could think of that old question, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it still make a noise? I always said the correct answer to that is, a tree falls and that's going to cause a lot of sound waves, and sound waves are just, like waves and vibrating through the medium of air. There is the physical stuff that would cause the sound, right? If there's sound waves going through the medium of the air that we have in our atmosphere, and it interacts with our cochlea and whatnot, our auditory perceptual apparatus in our ears. Those are the kinds of things, the sound waves, that would have to get to our ears and we would hear the sound. So the primary qualities are there and they would cause the secondary qualities, the sound. The sound is a secondary quality. It's something that is perceived. But if no one's around to hear it, then the potential secondary qualities are never experienced. Only the primary qualities that would cause the secondary qualities. So empiricism gets really weird. The rationalists get really weird too, but a little too weird for me to feel like even talking about. But just to show you just how weird empiricism can actually get, there was an empiricist named Bishop Berkeley, and he said, we know that our perceptions exist because if no one was around, I mean, that's really the only thing we can directly see is our own perceptions. We never know that there's something behind those perceptions causing them. So let's be parsimonious, Occam's razor. Let's just say there is nothing causing the perceptions. We just have these perceptions, and there's no world causing them. In fact, to make sense of that, let's just say that God basically streams all of our perceptions into our mind. That's a simpler explanation than saying that there's this world out there and there's all these other things causing it. Personally, if you believe in God, I would think that he has better things to do than to live stream made up worlds into your minds. And it seems like it would be simpler just to have a world that interacts with our minds. But neat idea, Berkeley. And then there's David Hume. David Hume kind of took this idea a little further and was kind of on Berkeley's side that we can only ever really see our perceptions, so we can't claim to have knowledge of what's behind those perceptions. But he also, I don't believe he was very religious. Didn't appeal to the God thing. He just kind of said, I don't know. I have my perceptions, and I'm not going to talk about what's causing them because I have no right to. I can't know that. The empiricists become very skeptical and just have to live with that skepticism. He also came up with what are called the problems of induction and cause and effect, which should demonstrate just how skeptical the empirical movement can really be. And these are sort of the philosophical underpinnings of empiricism. Later, when we meet psychologists who are actually using these ideas, they don't really talk about this stuff directly, but these are sort of the ideas that are simmering beneath the surface, or the possibilities that, if you went out with a beer with some of these empiricist psychologists that we meet later, they would have something to say about these matters that are kind of along a similar vein. But anyway, what is an induction? An inductive inference is basically a generalization. Let's see. Let me think. What's a good example of a generalization? If I try a new food, I don't know what you call it. Let's call it beef Wellington. I've never had beef Wellington. You try beef Wellington for the first time and you get sick. Okay. Next time you want to try it, you don't know if it was the beef Wellington that made you sick. Maybe something else that happened that day made you sick. Maybe you were already sick. They ask you if you want to try it again. You say sure. So you try it again and you get sick again. So you make an inductive inference. I got sick these 2 times I tried beef Wellington, so beef Wellington must make me sick. And Hume says, you can't know that. There's always some other explanation. It could just be a second coincidence. You can never conclusively make this kind of generalization until you've exhausted every possible observation. And you might be thinking, wow, that's taking skepticism really far, isn't it? And then think about cause and effect. You go to play pool, you shoot your billiard ball, it strikes another ball, you hear this loud noise, and the first ball that you hit stops, but the next one that it hit immediately shoots forward. So we see that as causation. And Hume says, well, wait, how do you know that first ball didn't just stop on its own right next to the other one, and the other one just spontaneously sped off on its own? You didn't see the causation, you saw a coincidence, and you're just assuming there's causation. Empiricism gets very skeptical. I can't emphasize that enough. And in general, whenever psychology became a science rather than a branch of philosophy, you have to keep in mind that it's embedded in this milieu of skepticism. You have to provide strong evidence for your theory, such strong evidence that it would survive the scrutiny of a skeptic. Maybe not quite as big of a skeptic as Hume is being here, but skepticism is baked into the empirical method. And psychology eventually became an empirical science. Here's another, this is an important quote from Hume, and I just want to frame it a little bit first. There was a period in, not just in psychology, but in many sciences, called positivism. And we're going to talk about it more later, but I'm going to preview it now. Positivism was basically a school of thought that didn't want to talk about anything other than what we can directly observe. We can observe the billiard ball moving towards the other billiard ball, stopping. There's a sound, and then the other billiard ball spontaneously starts going. We can directly observe that. You can call it causation. We'll just call it what we observed. We stick to observation. And the reason they were so uppity about this is not just because of the rampant philosophical skepticism, but also during this period, there were a lot of debates about free will and about God and about the nature of reality. And there were some pretty bizarre theoretical frameworks out there. And these empiricists were pretty sick of it and said, we need some sort of rule or criteria for getting rid of all this metaphysical stuff, all this speculative stuff that you can't see. So here's what Hume said. In a nutshell, Hume said, look, it's either something you directly observed, i.e., it's empirical, or it's true as a matter of definition. Okay? So empirically, you can observe billiard balls moving around, and definitionally, you define what a billiard ball is, and you define what a pool cue is. We need definitions to get off the ground and make observations, and you can logically deduce implications from definitions, and you can form your theories in terms of definitions, but that's basically it. Anything else that's not an observation or a definition doesn't belong. That's basically what he's saying. And you see this quote all the time if you go deep dive through the history of ideas. He says, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Ouch. Like I said, this is Hume's way of saying, if it's not true by definition and it's not an observation, then it's not allowed. We're not giving it any credence. Ignore it. It's just metaphysics. The only way you can be objective and scientific is if you stick only with what you can observe and what you can just define and delineate. That brings us to Auguste Comte. He was a radical empiricist, if you didn't think all these other empiricists were radical enough, and he founded positivism. It's the view, like I said, that the only thing we can be certain about is our own observations. See, they're going towards a more empirical, scientific direction. We want to get away from metaphysics. We want to get away from religion. And we want to stick with just observations, repeatable experiments, define your terms, be very concrete, no metaphysics, no make-believe. That's their words, not mine. Don't get mad at me. And interestingly enough, Comte was one of the many thinkers that we talk about in this course, at least for this first module or two, who didn't think a science of the mind or psychology was possible. Comte said the mind can't observe itself, so there can't be an empirical science of it. So this gives you a picture of where psychology emerged from. This is what the field of ideas looked like. If you can only study publicly observable, replicable processes, physicists can do that, chemists can do that. If you're studying electricity, you can describe the experimental apparatus and repeat the experiment yourself. But how would you do that by observing your own consciousness? Because you can't do that. You can't look inward and see your own mind working, or at least that's how the argument goes. And then this is the last one. Part 2 is over after this slide. You have Immanuel Kant. Kant started off as a rationalist in the vein of Descartes. He believed that we have innate ideas and that we actively construct the world from those ideas. The world inspires us to create our ideas and arrive at our knowledge, but it's not really the main source. That's just basic rationalism. But he ended up reading David Hume, the great skeptic, and he said, let me see. Yes, this is a direct quote from Kant. David Hume's attack on metaphysics was more decisive for its fate than any other event. Since the earliest recorded beginnings of metaphysics, and it was my recollection of David Hume that broke into my dogmatic slumber. This is a very big turning point when Kant realized that all of his ideas and his thoughts on how the world works and how the mind works and everything, he just read Hume and it all came crashing down. So what Kant ended up doing is synthesizing empiricism and rationalism together. And he doesn't get a lot, I've read a lot of histories of psychology. They don't really stop and remark on that. They kind of just say he's a rationalist, let's move on. But while he was a rationalist, he was a very special kind of rationalist, because what he said was that while we might have certain innate ideas, those ideas don't mean anything unless they're being used in conjunction with the world. Our sensory experiences are meaningless without some sort of mental faculties already in place to make sense of them. So you have to have a mind in place to be able to perceive, but the mind wouldn't have any content if it didn't have anything to perceive. He said, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind, which in his jargon is what I just said, is you need both. You need to have not innate concepts, but innate faculties. You have the capacity to perceive and you have the capacity to remember, but unless you have experiences, those capacities will go unused, and they have to get used in order for you to get knowledge. So you need both. Also, he didn't think there could ever be a science of the mind because the mind can't observe itself. So that's it for this module. It's module 1, and I will see y'all for our module 2.